In this lesson, we're continuing to learn about Vuex. Specifically, we'll look at state and getters. We'll look at how we can access our state from the Vuex store, how we can use getters for derive state, and then how to map our state and getters to computed properties within our components. Let's get started. We'll first take a look at how we can access state from our store from within our components. But first, if we take a look at our main.js file, we see we're importing store. That is our Vuex store. Then we are using our store in our Vue instance. This injects the store into all of our components so they can have direct access to it. So if we open up our store.js file, we can start to add some state to our Vuex store. We'll add a user object with an ID and a name. Now we can access this user state from any component we want to. But since we are soon going to be creating events where we will need to know the user who created them, let's go to our event create component. Right here from the template, I can use an expression and say $store, since this was injected into the component, then state and user. Awesome, we are displaying our user object in the browser. If we take a look at the Vue DevTools, we can click on the Vuex tab and see our state. Let's now just print out the name of our user object. We'll go back into our template and say .name. And now we're just displaying the user's name. But what if we wanted to access the same state in multiple places in our template? We can start to use a computed property for that. So we'll go ahead and cut this in order to use it below. Then I'm going to use the vbase snippet to scaffold a component. Now here in the computed, I'm going to create a username computed property. And then in the return, I'll paste what we cut earlier. The difference here is I need to use this .store. Now in my template, I can say create an event, and then use the username to print out that state. And I can use the username in multiple places in my template. Now in the browser, we can see the state displayed twice via a computed property. Now if I also wanted to access the user ID, I could add another computed property and call it user ID. And this could return user.id. But let's say we also have some categories in our state, which I'll paste now. These are available in the article below this video. Now I can go back to my event create component, and I could create a whole nother categories computed property. But there's also something we can use called map state. So I'll import that from Vuex. And what map state does is allow us to map state into computed properties. So I'll say map state. Then I can say username. As you can see here, we're passing in state and returning state.username. I can make another one for user ID with a similar syntax. Here I'll say state.user.id. And then for categories, we'll pass in state and return state.categories. But let's look at an even simpler way to map our state. If we just have a top-level state, meaning we're not using dot notation to access a property on that state, I could use a string here, categories, to refer to that state. Now let's say I just want to access the user object for my state. I could do so like this. Now the difference here is I would use dot notation in the template to get the user name and ID. Now I'll quickly go ahead and print out these categories. We'll use Emmet to create an unordered list. And I'll say v4 cat in categories. We'll bind the key to cat. And then print out the category in each list item. Looking in the browser, now we see our username, ID, and categories are all showing up through computed properties that are mapped to our state. Now, we can name our map state or not, meaning currently we have the names user and categories. These names could be whatever we wanted them to be, but we don't need to use the names. Instead, we could transform this into an array and just paste in the strings here. Now this will work exactly like we just had it. Now let's take a look at the object spread operator and how it allows us to mix in local computed properties. Looking at our computed property, we see that map state is taking up this entire object. But what if we wanted to add in another local computed property? The object spread operator allows us to do this with these three dots. This allows us to write in additional computed properties. In case you're wondering, the object spread operator isn't specific to Vue. It's newer JavaScript syntax, and you can learn about it in the lesson resources. Now, let's take another look at accessing state with getters. Now, if we wanted to access the length of our categories array, we could make a computed property for that and return this $store.categories.length. And that would work, but if we wanted to access our categories length from multiple places within our application, instead, we could use a getter for that. So we'll go over to our store.js, add the getters property, and create a cat length getter. It'll take in the state, then return state.categories.length. Now we can use the cat length getter from anywhere in our application. So we'll go back to event create and change this out to store.getters.catLength. Now in our template, we'll print out the cat length with an expression. Now in the browser, we can see it's printing out correctly. There are 7 categories. There might be certain use cases in your application where you need to pass a getter to a getter. Let's look at how we can achieve that. If we have an array of to-do objects in our state, we could create a getter that gets the done to-dos. It could take in the state and then return state.todos.filter and filter by the to-dos that are labeled done. Now, if we wanted to figure out the active to-dos count, or the to-dos that are not done, we could pass a getter into this getter. It could return state.todos.length minus getters.done-to-dos.length. Now, this will return the difference between our total to-dos and the to-dos that are done. Obviously, there's other ways to get our active to-dos count. I just wanted to show you how you could pass the entire getters object to a getter. So let's take a look at a different way to get our active to-dos count. In the same way that we got our done to-dos, we could copy this, paste it in here, and look for the to-dos that are not done. Then get the length of that. Now, we no longer need to pass in our getters. Sometimes we might want to make our getters dynamic by passing an argument into it. Let's look at how we can do that. In our state, we now have an events array full of event objects. So let's create a getter called getEventById. This can take in the state and then return another function which takes in the ID and returns state.events.find, so we can find the event where the event ID is equal to the ID that is passed in. Now, back in our event create component, we can create a computed property called getEvent, which returns this $store.getters.getEventById. Now we can use that in our template. We'll say getEvent, then we can pass in an ID of 1. Taking a look at our browser, we can see that we're displaying the event with the ID of 1. Just like earlier, how we used the map state shortcut, we can use map getters to map getters to our computed properties. So we'll import map getters as well from Vuex. Now we'll use the spread operator to add map getters, and then we'll add getEventById. Now in our template, we just need to change this to getEventById, and if we search with 2, it looks like it's working. The browser's displaying the event with the ID of 2. Now let's review. In this lesson, we looked at accessing our state directly from within our components. Then we looked at several different ways to use getters to access derived state. Then we looked at mapping our state and getters to our components' computed properties. In the next lesson, we'll look at adding to our state with mutations and actions. See you there. If in our state we had an array of to-do objects, what?
Let
Let me start that over.
That's the sound of like.